Some things happen without explanation. Some experiences haunt people for a lifetime. This is where I tell those mysteries. And remember, not everything can be explained. Story. Has anyone heard of the Bloodworth incident? Everyone's talking about it, but I have no idea what it is. It was only my second day when I first heard about the Bloodworth incident. Janelle brought it up while we were eating lunch. Of course, after the Bloodworth incident, my wife and I got an entire home security system. It cost a fortune, but it's worth the peace of mind. I wasn't really interested in the conversation. I was more interested in scarfing down the burrito in front of me. So I didn't ask what the Bloodworth incident was. But then it came up again, and again, and again. Stan. We haven't left our curtains open since Bloodworth. Caitlin. I probably would have been a nurse forever if Bloodworth had never happened. But I just didn't feel safe anymore. Larry. Did you catch that special on the Bloodworth incident last night? Unlike my coworkers, I was new to Green Creek. I figured the Bloodworth incident was some sort of local thing that happened a few years ago. Maybe a convict escaped from prison named Bloodworth. Maybe there was an accident on Bloodworth Street, or a flu outbreak named Bloodworth. I was curious, but the social pressure to appear like everyone else kept me from asking. But then, the comments got weirder. I'm writing a novel for NaNoWriMo this year. Aaliyah said during lunch, it's about what life would be like if the Bloodworth incident had never happened. Ooh, that's such a good idea. Stan said, that sounds so interesting. I would love to read that. Janelle said, wait, what? Now they were talking about it like it was a national, life-altering disaster, not just some local incident. There was a pause in the conversation, and I finally took my chance. Wait, sorry, I'm confused. What's the Bloodworth incident? Aaliyah looked me dead in the eye, and then she burst into laughter. Slowly, my other coworkers broke into laughter, too, until everyone at the table was chuckling. You're funny, Amanda, Aaliyah said, shooting me a grin. I like you. I wanted to say no. I'm serious. What is it? But there was something about the atmosphere that made me uncomfortable. So I said nothing. When I got home, I spent an hour on Google. Bloodworth incident. Bloodworth, Green Creek, Pennsylvania. Nothing came up. I tried multiple combinations of keywords, even fiddling with the time range for search results. And still, nada. But when I woke up the next morning, everything was crystal clear. It's a prank, a sort of hazing ritual. For new hires, it made sense. The software development team was a rambunctious, loosey-goosey crowd. Stan swore all the time. Caitlin came to work in sweatpants. Lunchtime conversation included borderline inappropriate topics, like past tales of drunken revelry or TMI details of Stan's recent divorce. This is exactly the kind of thing they'd pull. Besides, if the Bloodworth incident really happened, they wouldn't mention it so often. It came up almost every day, like they were trying to talk about it as much as possible. Unfortunately, I couldn't confront them today. It was a Saturday, so I spent my morning at the local coffee shop, getting some editing work done for my side hustle. That's when things got weird. Two young women sat down at the next booth, talking loudly about the party last night, and a few minutes into their conversation, I heard them mention it. I haven't slept through the night since the Bloodworth incident. I froze. So it wasn't some prank in the office. It was something other people knew about in the town. For a minute, I just sat there in silence, my mind reeling. Then I cut in. "Excuse me. Sorry to bother you. But, could you tell me what the Bloodworth incident is?" Both of the girls turned to me. Then the brunette one stood up. Sorry. We have to go," she said quickly. I watched as the two girls hurried out, glancing back to make sure I wasn't following. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I called my mom that afternoon. She had never heard of the Bloodworth incident. I texted a few of my friends. They also had no idea what it was. I drove to a Walmart just a few miles outside the town's border. Struck up a conversation with the cashier and mentioned the Bloodworth incident. She stared up at me with wide blue eyes. "The what incident?" I drove back into town, on the narrow 2-lane route that snaked through the forest. Just beyond the old, hand-painted "Welcome to Green Creek" sign, there was a little gas station. It looked like it had seen better days. From the paint peeling on the mini-mart to the rust creeping up the sides of the pumps. I went into the mini-mart, poured myself a coffee, and made my way to the bored-looking man sitting behind the counter. "Coffee? This late?" he asked. With a smile. It was almost 7, starting to get dark. "Haven't been sleeping much since Bloodsworth," I replied, pulling out my wallet. A pause. "Oh, yeah, it's been crazy. Sometimes I get up in the middle of the night and check the locks." He rang up my coffee. 2:13. I handed him my card. And then I decided to push a little. "Aren't you afraid he might break in through the windows?" He looked up at me. Brows furrowed. Sorry, I meant, she. His expression darkened. His gaze flicked to the door, and then he stood up, taking a step towards me. What is he doing? Every muscle in my body froze. Is he going to try something? Get out. Get out now. You don't know what the Bloodworth incident is. Do you? He asked. No. You sure as hell better not let anyone know. I stood there, frozen, stunned. Seconds later, the bells jingled behind me as another customer entered. He smiled and waved, like nothing had happened. I turned on my heel and ran back to the car. It was starting to get dark. Deep blue shadows stretched across the road from the bare trees, like giant claws. I started up the car and pulled out onto the road, headlights blaring into the darkness. Don't let anyone know. Why? Was it some sort of conspiracy? Or a cult thing? Maybe a cult leader lived in town. Maybe he'd brainwashed everyone here, and invented an incident to fearmonger his followers into behaving. Or maybe not knowing about the incident was some sort of signal that I wasn't a member of the cult, that I should be hunted down. As I drove down Main Street, I passed the town library. But then an idea hit me. I made a U-turn and pulled into the tiny parking lot. A woman sat behind the desk, working a computer that looked like it was from 2 decades ago. She reminded me of a huggable little grandmother, with her oversized spectacles, gray hair, and knit sweater. Do you keep old newspapers? Like local ones, from a few years ago? Of course, she replied, with a sweet smile. You can find them down there. I walked down one of the aisles to where the microfilms were kept. My footsteps sounded loud in the silence, echoing among the dusty books. I grabbed a film from 2000 and started my search, scanning article after article on the screen, looking for any mention of the Bloodworth incident. I honestly didn't expect to find anything. But then I came across an issue of the Green Creek Sentinel from July 3, 2005. Heart-hammering. I began to read, Town Rocked by Bloodworth Incident, by Jody McFarlane. On the morning of July 2nd, a horror shook our little town of Green Creek, Pennsylvania. Nearly half of our residents woke to find their front doors mysteriously open, with a dark, sticky substance pooled on the floor. But that was only the beginning. Those residents began to exhibit. Continued on page 2. I flipped the page and gasped. The entire article was scribbled out with black marker. There was even a photo of the main street. Grainy, black and white. I could make out the library, the other shops, the sky, but the marker had scribbled over most of the street. But not fully. I could make out a pair of shoes, as if someone were lying there, a body, and if I used my imagination, based on how many scribbled out blobs there were, I'd guess there were no less than 20 bodies in the middle of the street. I clapped a hand to my mouth. I clicked wildly at the mouse, moving through the next few issues, looking for any mention of Bloodworth. I didn't find any, but I did find something. A tribute to Jody McFarlane. We sadly mourn the death of our very own head journalist, Jody McFarlane. She was only 41 years old. A voice snapped me out of my trance. What are you doing? I whipped around. The librarian was standing right behind me. But she didn't look so warm and fuzzy now. Her expression was dark, stone-like, as she stared at the screen in front of me. A quiet fury in her eyes. Behind her glasses. I'm sorry. I was just. You came here to find out about Bloodworth, didn't you? She snarled. You don't know about it. You're one of them. I expected her to lunge at me, grab me, chase me, but instead, she tilted her head towards the ceiling and let out the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. Shuffling, rustling sounds echoed from the other aisles. I broke into a run, leapt past her, sprinting as fast as I possibly could. Once I made it to the atrium, I glanced back. 3 other townspeople were running towards me, shouting to each other. I ran for my life. Miraculously, I made it out to the car. As I pulled away, I saw them standing at the door, staring at me, like an idiot. I thought I'd lost them. But as soon as I pulled out onto Main Street, I heard a police siren pierce the air. Red and blue lights flashed in my rear view. I pushed the pedal to the floor. As soon as I crossed the town's boundary, the gas station, the sign, the officer pulled off to the side of the road. He didn't follow me. He just watched me as I sped away from that place. I never went back, never got my stuff. I got a new job, moved 3 states away, and started my post-college life over again. I assumed that was the end of it, and I'd never hear about the Bloodworth incident again. I was wrong. Several months after the move, I met someone. He just moved to my city, and our dates have been phenomenal. I've taken him to the best restaurants and museums, showed him everything there is to do here. We were just about to celebrate our first month together, when he said something that stopped me in my tracks. You really should get a deadbolt for the door, he said casually, as we watched TV on the couch. 'Cause We wouldn't want another Bloodworth incident, would we? Story. I accidentally solved a murder. My story takes place a few years ago. I'm a 25-year-old female now. But back then I was the ripe age of 23. And had a sudden stroke of luck. I'd saved up for my first home. And in my search, I came across a fairly old Victorian in a rural neighborhood of Port Perry, Ontario. The house was beautiful, well priced, and close to my place of work. Without much of a second thought, I'd snatched it up, and within a matter of weeks I was moving into my new home. I remember the day I moved in vividly. I stood on the small, white cobblestone pathway leading up to the wooden wraparound porch stairs, grinning up at the house's vacant windows. Its brick was a pale yellow, recently repainted, and its intricate trimmings a bright white that contrasted sharply with the coal-black shingles of the roof. Its pointed spires silhouetted against a spotless blue sky. I had sighed contentedly, tearing my eyes away from the house and glancing around the rest of the property. It had been mid-fall, October 15th to be exact, and the forest behind the house was a patchwork quilt of colors. The leaves fell gently to the ground, carried by a crisp autumn breeze, blanketing the forest floor in the earthy tones of autumn. Focusing my attention back on the task at hand, I began making my way up the path, my box of kitchen utensils in hand. The movers I'd hired strode past me, throwing me the occasional smile and asking where I wanted things. And I would reply politely with directions. On my third trip out to the truck, I got the distinct feeling of being stared at. Turning around, I expected to find one of the men, but instead found that I was alone. Before I had the opportunity to brush it off, however, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. In one of the upstairs windows, I just barely caught the silhouette of a person slip out of view. It was there 1 second and gone the next so quickly. I blinked a few times, thinking that last night's insomnia had made me imagine things. I made a mental note to go to bed early that night. And with a sense of unease, I entered the house. Little did I know, that first day would be the beginning of a series of disturbing encounters that would make me a local hero and a firm believer in the unknown. That same night I lay awake in my new bedroom, staring up at the ceiling as the sounds of nature drifted lazily through my cracked window. Back in the city, there had been a constant barrage of noise every night, and I'd realized quickly that it would take me time to adjust to the lack thereof. Eventually, sleep claimed me, and I drifted off to the soft sound of crickets chirping out in the woods. At first, I floated in a warm void, barely lucid as I drifted. Then gradually, the abyss began to morph and change into something familiar, shapes forming around me as they emerged from the all-consuming darkness. As they formed, light followed, and I suddenly found my world illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp. I was in my living room. The lamp glowed faintly as I blinked. Getting my bearings, glancing to my right, I saw the front hall, and the giant bay window above my couch as I peered out of it. A waxing moon glared back at me from above high treetops. Inching closer, I squinted, thinking I could make out a figure in the distance facing the house. They stood still as stone, hidden in the shadows of the tree line, and even with yards between us I felt their stare penetrating through me. Instinctively, I cowered away from the window, feeling the need to put as much space between myself and the strange being outside as possible. In a panic, I blinked rapidly, and in the next second I was looking into one of the most mangled faces I'd ever seen. She stood at no more than 4 feet, her skinny frame draped in a blood-soaked nightgown that, upon closer inspection, I believed had once been a crisp white. It was torn and muddied in certain places, as if she had recently clawed her way out of her own grave. And to add to the picture, twigs and leaves had entangled themselves in her greasy black hair. To my horror, as I took her in unblinkingly, chunks of her skull also seemed to be missing, exposing the inside of her rotted cranium to the elements. She stared back at me with a chillingly dead expression, her empty sockets slowly oozing a chunky dark substance down her decomposing cheeks. The skin on her face sagged, an ashen gray pocketed with craters of rock that revealed glistening white patches of bone. I watched, trembling, as she haltingly lifted a broken arm and placed her pale hand on the window. She opened her mouth, and I could almost hear the crack of bone, as if it were the first time she had tried to speak in decades. She mouthed only 2 words. "Help me." Snapping out of it, I screamed, stumbling back from the window. This only seemed to agitate her though, as she began beating her small fists on the glass, howling her demand, "Help me, help me, help me, help me, help me, help me." The dark substance seemed to thicken as it poured from her eyes, soaking her decayed face in crimson streaks. I clapped both my hands over my ears, screwing my eyes shut as her shrill wails pierced through me, dropping to my knees as I began to cry. "Okay," I pleaded over her anguished screams. "I'll help you, but please, just let me go." Silence. It was as if someone had unplugged the speaker, and the music had suddenly been cut off. I was too frightened to open my eyes, but I was forced to when I felt the splash of cold liquid hit my forehead. She stared back at me, inches from my face now, drops of blood spattering onto the skin of my forehead as she hovered over me. "Wake up!" I shot up in my bed, flailing blindly as I screamed, tearing at the sheets entangled around my sweaty body. Blinking away tears, I cried out as sunlight suddenly burned my eyes, flinching back against my headboard as I shook violently. I stayed like that for almost an hour, crying softly to myself as I tried to come to terms with what I'd just gone through. That nightmare had been like nothing I had ever experienced in my life. And even though it was still early in the morning, I refused to go back to sleep. Eventually I pulled myself together and managed to get out of bed. But not before turning every light I could find on in the house. I felt tempted to chide myself for acting so childishly, but I was too terrified to care at the time. I got showered, dressed and did my makeup, grabbing my things for work and preparing to rush out the door when something stopped me in my tracks. On my kitchen counter, beside my car keys, was a single drop of crimson. At the sight of it I gasped, and without thinking I snatched my keys and ran out of the house. I went through the motions of that day, barely aware of my surroundings as I worked. My mind was still back at my house, going over all the plausible possibilities for why I would find a single fresh drop of blood in the one place there shouldn't be one. I exhausted all theories, but by the end of the day I was drained and confused, knowing for a fact that it hadn't been there the day before. and that it wasn't mine. As I drove through my neighborhood, I slowed to a stop at the curb, glaring up at my new home. It loomed over me in the setting sun, its windows dark and empty, as if the structure itself were glaring back. At that point, I had been determined to brush it off as nothing, chalking it up as having an explanation I couldn't think of at the time. I wanted to enjoy my new home, and as I turned to grab my things and lock my car, that's exactly what I had planned to do, until I turned back around and saw that a single light was on in my upstairs bedroom window. My first thought was that someone had broken in and slipped up, so I called the police. They came minutes later, and after a thorough sweep, they came back with nothing to show for it. There had been no sign of forced entry or anything taken, and they'd searched high and low for a culprit, but the only thing they'd found was my bedroom light on. After a short lecture on not wasting the police department's time, and remembering to turn off my lights before leaving the house to prevent scares like this, they left, and I found myself standing alone on my front porch. Nervously, I sucked in a breath between my teeth and cracked the door open. I walked into the front parlor, looking around apprehensively, but finding nothing out of place. Turning on the lights, I sauntered over to the kitchen counter, and to my surprise, it was clean. The drop of blood was gone. The house was eerily silent, but an atmosphere of heaviness hung in the air. I'd never noticed it before, but as I stood in my kitchen, it almost felt like the air itself was trying to suffocate me. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker. I jumped, looking up at the old bulbs in my kitchen ceiling. I watched them, almost mesmerized, as the flickering continued, wondering vaguely if I'd have to call someone to come and check the fuse box. Without warning, they flared an almost blinding white, searing my eyes. I cried out, covering my face in a vain effort to shield them, and it was a good thing I did too. Because seconds later, I heard the telling pop, pop, pop of the bulbs exploding one by one above me. Glass rained down around me, scattering noisily at my feet as I stood frozen to the spot. Shakily, I removed my hands, finding that the entire house was in darkness. The only light came through the window over my kitchen sink, illuminating the room well enough to see the shards glinting on the ground surrounding me. I glanced around, shocked, unbelieving of what had just happened, but the worst was yet to come. As my eyes adjusted to the sudden lack of light, I noticed movement at the top of the stairs from my peripheral vision. Slowly, I lifted my head to look at the source. Sitting on the top step was the girl from my nightmare. "What?" I panted, my eyes almost popping out of their sockets. "The fuck?" Letting out a low, demonic chuckle, she stood and began descending the stairs. Clutching the banister in her splintered hand, she began to speak. "You," she hissed lowly, her empty eyes burning into mine, "have not kept your promise to me." Rooted to the spot, all I could do was shake in terror. "You have done nothing to help me," she continued, growing closer and emitting a kind of rage a small child shouldn't be capable of. "You chose to forget me today, just like everyone else. I'm so sorry," I croaked out, tears cascading down my face. "Please, just don't hurt me." She stood in front of me now, the only thing separating us being a foot of kitchen tile. She was noticeably shorter than me, being that she was so young. But somehow, I felt like the child standing before an authority figure. She stared up at me silently for a moment, her ashen cheeks glistening with slowly dripping blood. The droplets hit the floor between us in the deafening silence, splattering softly on the ceramic. With each drop that hit the floor, I flinched. "I will give you one more chance," she said softly, her bloody sockets unblinking. "Find me." With that, she vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. Not wasting any time, I broke out of my paralysis and bolted out the door. Glass crunched underfoot as I ran, tears streaming down my face, until my feet hit the pavement and I practically flung myself on my car's driver's side door. Hyperventilating, I nearly yanked it off as I threw it open and climbed inside, slamming it behind me. In the silence, I trembled, gasping for breath as I struggled to regain control over my breathing before I passed out. I stared down at my hands with blurry eyes, gripping my steering wheel so tightly in my fists. My knuckles had gone a painful-looking white. It could have been 20 minutes to an hour before I had the courage to start driving. When I did, I was still in a daze, unsure of how to think or where to go until I pulled on to a quick street, spotting a dingy old motel on the corner. Knowing I would rather spend time with roaches than whatever was in my house, I pulled into the parking lot. I got out, paid, and took my meager belongings with me into my room. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I let out a sigh of relief, before deciding to take a much-needed shower. In the shower, as I lathered my hair with cheap complimentary shampoo, an idea occurred to me. The ghost, or whatever she was, had wanted me to find her, so that could only mean that she'd been someone at one point. Maybe even someone with a loving family. The more I thought about, the more I wondered if something had happened to her in that house. After getting out, wrapped in a towel, I sat on the edge of my bed drying my hair. Glancing to my right, I noticed my work laptop, and on a whim, I opened it up and began to do a search on the house. To my surprise, the first thing that popped up was an article. As I read, I paled more with every sentence. In the article, it talked about the previous owners of my house. They had been a family of 4. A husband and wife with 2 young children that smiled happily for the camera in the picture provided by the article. At the time, the oldest was a 7-year-old boy named Jonathan, and his younger sister Madison had been no more than 5. I'd gasped loudly as I saw their daughter, recognizing her right away. It was her. According to the report, Madison had been declared a missing person when she had mysteriously vanished from their home's backyard almost 13 years ago. The family had been beside themselves, and her older brother, the last person to see her alive, claimed that a man had approached them and had lured her away into the woods behind the house. Although they had searched the surrounding area tirelessly, they had found no one with the description the brother had provided, and turned up no sign of Madison. Eventually, with no leads, Madison's case had gone cold and was forgotten. With a shaking hand, I covered my mouth, tears pooling in my eyes for the second time that night as I recalled her words. "You chose to forget me today, just like everyone else." "No, Madison, I won't forget you like everyone else," I whispered into the silence, a sudden surge of determination bringing me to my feet. I stared down at the innocent face of the girl on my screen, a fiery rage swelling inside of me. Whoever had taken the smile off that child's face, I thought angrily, would finally answer to justice for their heinous crimes. Closing the lid of my laptop, I went to get dressed. It took me all of 20 minutes to return to the house. By now, it was 4 a.m. and my eyes had burned as I'd struggled to focus on the road. By some miracle, though, I had made it back without getting in an accident, and the minute I laid eyes on the looming structure of my home, I was suddenly wide awake with adrenaline. Stepping out of the car, I slowly crept my way up the cobblestone path that cut through my yard. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. Stepping into the front hall, the house was exactly as I'd left it hours before. Glass strewn everywhere on the kitchen floor and crushed by my earlier mad dash to escape. This time, though, as I stood silently at the threshold, there was no crushing oppression in the air. If anything, it was tinged with deep sorrow and an underlying feeling of desperation. "Madison," I called out softly, apprehension stinging at the back of my throat. "Honey, I'm so sorry I ran away. But I think I've figured out a way to help you." Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow shifted at the end of the hall in the darkness. There was a beat of silence. "How?" came a faint, but hopeful whisper. "I need you to lead me to the last place you remember being when you were alive. Or became a spirit." I replied back gently, praying she took to the idea. Slowly, she lurched towards me from down the hallway. It took everything in me to not run away screaming again as she approached, limping towards me until she came to a complete stop at the edge of the doorway. Cast in the faint light of the moon pouring in from behind me, shadows much darker than I felt they should have been stretched across her disfigured face and body, giving her an almost demonic appearance. But I knew better. Swallowing my fear, I spoke. "Let me get a shovel and a compass. And I promise, Madison, I won't stop looking until I find you." She smiled at me with a mouth full of bloody, broken teeth. Finally, never in my life did I expect to be following the ghost of a dead girl through the woods at night. I have to admit, it felt like some kind of bizarre nightmare at the time. But as I'd trailed after her, I pinched myself repeatedly, but never managed to wake up. I wondered vaguely if that was how it had felt to her for the past 13 years. This thought propelled me forward into the cold night, my breath coming out in foggy puffs as I kept pace with her at a distance. She was only a few feet ahead of me, the slim silhouette of her back a beacon in the darkness that engulfed us. We could have walked for an hour or more by the time we'd arrived. But the night showed no sign of fading. The only thing I knew was that my feet already hurt, and that we were deep into the forest, the house long behind us. Without warning, she had come to a sudden stop, barely giving me enough time to avoid her before we collided, although I doubted anything would happen if we had. "Here," she spoke, her broken voice barely above a whisper. She pointed at a patch of ground covered by a heavy-looking rock. It seemed out of place compared to the rest of the forest, like it had been put there by someone on purpose. This immediately raised my suspicions, and I stepped into the patch of moonlight to stand beside her in the small clearing. "I woke up here years ago," she murmured, staring down at the stone with an unreadable expression. "All I remember from before that is that me and my brother had been playing in the house." I stepped forward, brandishing my shovel. The tempered steel glinted in the broken moonlight coming through the trees above. stirring a surreal feeling inside of me. Well, this is as good of a place to start as any. With that, my shovel hit the earth as I began to dig. I dug under the stone, eventually managing to roll it to the side to offer myself more space to get at the earth beneath it. I dug where it had been, my suspicions growing with every pile of dirt that I tossed aside. God only knows how much time had passed before the sun started to peek between the trees. And I hit more than soil. My breath caught as my shovel snagged on something buried deep. Taking a shaky breath, I prepared for the worst, and began shoveling more frantically. With each pile of dirt I flung over my shoulder, I uncovered what looked like a bundle of old blankets with something inside. Before I knew it, I was standing over an open grave. The blankets, although dirty and worn, were noticeably soaked in places with dried brown stains, and the stench of death was undeniable. Even though the body was years old, slowly, I knelt over her and gently pulled back some of the blanket. What stared back at me was the familiar, decomposed face of Madison. I covered my mouth with a clammy hand, fighting back the urge to vomit. I stumbled back from her grave, tripping and slamming into the trunk of a tree behind me by accident. I stood there for a moment, shaken to my core, before slowly sliding to my knees, feeling them hit the damp earth beneath me. I cried inconsolably, both with relief and a whirlwind of different emotions. Madison had finally been found, and as the dawn chased away the darkness, I felt her behind me. A small hand touched my shoulder, as if she were trying to comfort me. Not daring to look up, I spoke a single sentence. I found you. Not long after I found Madison's body, the truth of her death finally came to light. Her skeleton was exhumed from its grave, and her case was reopened. I was questioned by police, and with nothing up my sleeve, I told them the entire truth. In the end, they had no choice but to accept my testimony. But not really. They practically wrote me off as crazy, and put it down as an accidental discovery in their reports. Hence, I became the woman that accidentally solved a murder in my small town. And even a bit of a celebrity. An extensive investigation was done on the body, revealing some disturbing truths. They had found the DNA of her older brother on her clothing, among other things, such as a broken neck and blunt force trauma to her head. This trauma, according to the coroner, was the ultimate cause of her death. When her brother, who was an adult by then, had been brought in for questioning, he came clean about everything. According to his confession, he and his sister had been playing near the top of the stairs in their home, when he had accidentally been too rough and ended up pushing her down. The only one who'd been home at the time was their father, and he'd been the one to discover his son sobbing hysterically at the bottom of the staircase over the broken body of his sister. Panicking, in an attempt to save his son's future, their father had wrapped her body in blankets and left the house for hours, burying her deep in the woods before coming back and cleaning up the crime scene thoroughly. After that, they'd come up with a cover story, and had vowed to take it to their own graves. It seems the one thing they weren't counting on was their daughter haunting the house she'd died in. I watched with a heavy heart on the local news as they were convicted of unintentional manslaughter and taken away in cuffs. Outside the courthouse, Madison's mother stood surrounded by family off to the side, crying helplessly as she watched them go. Later, I received an unexpected invitation for Madison's funeral in the mail. Feeling a sense of moral obligation, I attended. Upon arrival, the first face I saw was Madison's mother. She looked rough, like she'd aged overnight. She stood at barely 5 feet tall, clad in a loose-fitting black dress that hung on her thin frame. Her shoulders were hunched as if she carried the weight of the world. Clutching a handkerchief to her heaving chest, and dark bags stood out against her lined, pale face, framed by barely tamed black curls streaked with gray. We made eye contact, and before I could react, she was standing in front of me. Her lip trembled as she clutched my hand in hers, looking up at me with pleading eyes that drove a spike through my heart. "Thank you for finding my little girl," she sobbed out brokenly, a few tears following the wrinkles in her cheeks. "I overheard from the police how you found her. And I know they don't believe you, but I do." She paused, as if searching for her next words. Have you seen her again since?" she asked quietly, but her words carried no less weight. I thought back to my life for the past few months. Since that night in the woods, I hadn't seen Madison, but in my heart I felt she was already doing better than she had been. Wherever she was now. "No, I'm sorry," I replied, squeezing her hand with a sympathetic look. "I just wish I could see her one more time," she said softly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I've been hoping for years that she was still alive, that she would come home. But I think I knew it would come to this." Her words had crushed me. I thought about my own mother, how she'd done everything in her power to protect me from the evil in the world, and how much we both trusted my father and sister. The realization of the pain she must be in consumed me, and before I could stop myself, I was pulling her into a tight hug. She went stiff for a moment, unsure of how to react. Then, before I could pull away and awkwardly apologize, she slid her arms around me, hugging me back. We stood like that for a moment, something unspoken passing between us. When we broke apart, she was smiling sadly. "Thank you. You have no idea how much I needed that," she said. "I feel like God sent you to me as my comforter." Too emotional to speak, I only nodded. "Would you like to sit with me in the front row during the service?" she asked. I smiled, a single tear streaking my cheek. "Yes, of course." The service was a solemn affair, but not without love. Madison was honored and cherished by everyone who'd known her in the short time she'd been alive. And when it was time to put her body to rest, I quietly followed the procession to the graveyard behind the church. Gathered around Madison's open grave, I squeezed her mother's trembling shoulder as they slowly lowered her into the ground. I fought hard to blink back tears, a whirlwind of emotions sweeping through me as the preacher spoke his final prayers. Without warning, Madison's mother suddenly stiffened, jerking her head to the right and gasping loudly. I followed her gaze, only to find a familiar face. 10 feet from her grave, next to an ancient oak, stood Madison and an unfamiliar young man. This time, however, Madison was the perfect picture of clean. She was standing next to the man in a pure white dress, her loose black hair falling around her youthful face in soft ringlets. The longer I looked, the more it felt like she was almost glowing with a soft ethereal white light. The man next to her was also handsome, dressed in a crisp white suit, and as I continued to stare, barely breathing. I noticed a set of pristine white wings tucked neatly behind his back. Madison waved at us joyfully, tears streaking down her rosy cheeks as she mouthed a silent, "Thank you." Smiling tearfully, I mouthed back 2 words, "You're welcome." Turning to the man, "No." The angel Madison took his hand in hers, nodding up at him, entwining his fingers with hers gently. He flashed us a warm smile, before they turned and began to walk away, both of them fading into the afternoon sunlight as they did. Story. My grandfather's World War II story was not what I expected. My grandfather has never once spoken about the war. Not to me, my father, or anyone else for that matter. All my life I've been curious about it. What unit did he belong to? Which battles was he involved in? Who were men he served with? And what happened to them? I know some veterans keep in contact with their old war buddies and revel in telling tales of combat over beers at the VFW, but not my Gramps. He preferred to pretend the war never happened. In fact, he hardly spoke at all. And even when he did say something, it was usually of the pass the salt variety. Last night he finally broke his silence. At my nephew's 3rd birthday party, after the cake had been eaten and the presents opened and the party was winding down, my Gramps called me out to the front porch. We settled into rocking chairs and he pulled out an ancient bottle of Jägermeister which he had liberated from the Germans and brought back after the war. He said he'd been saving it for the right occasion. Gramps cracked the bottle and we downed a few glasses. Even at the age of 91 he can still drink like a champ. We sipped in silence for about 15 minutes. Then, after all these years, he finally told me a war story. It was not what I expected. This is his story. In October of 1943 I turned 18 and volunteered for the Army. I was assigned to the military police platoon of the U.S. Army's 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. I stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. I'll never forget the water and sand, the dead bodies, the blood, the air filled with the sounds of machine gun fire and the screams of dying men. I pursued the Nazis across France, fighting and taking prisoners the entire way. I suffered through the cold and the snow in the Ardennes forest during the Battle of the Bulge, shivering in my foxhole while the trees exploded into splinters from German artillery shells. It was hell on earth, and I pray you'll never have to experience anything like it. But as terrible as that all was, there is one event that stands out from the rest. Names and faces fade with time, but I cannot forget this night no matter how hard I try. It is seared into my memory for one simple reason: it was the most terrible, horrifying, and unexplainable thing I've ever experienced. Even now, after all these years, it haunts my nightmares and keeps me awake night after night. It happened one night in early March of 1945 during Operation Lumberjack. While most of the 1st Infantry Division was pushing east towards the Remagen bridgehead, my unit was left behind to hold Bedburg, a small village near the Rhine River in western Germany. The village was left mostly undamaged by the war and had become a major crossroads for thousands of shell-shocked civilian refugees fleeing the fighting. As a military policeman, it was my job to secure and stabilize the town, keep the peace, and prevent our soldiers from abusing the population. We complained to each other about being stuck in rear while other units pushed the invasion forward. But if I'm being completely honest, I think we were all secretly relieved. We'd fought across the continent all the way from France, and now our thoughts had turned towards home. No one wanted to get killed right at the end of this war by some Nazi fanatic unwilling to see the writing on the wall. At this point, with the Americans and British advancing from the west and the Soviets closing in from the east, it was obvious to just about everyone that Germany would lose this war. While we weren't quite showered with chocolate and kisses as liberating heroes like we were in France, the Germans seemed friendly enough, and we were treated with deference by the town's war-weary citizens, most of whom were women, children, and old men. For the most part, they just seemed relieved that it was us and not the Soviets who had taken their village. The Russians had gained a nasty reputation for rape and murder in the cities they occupied in the east. Compared to that, we must have seemed like angels sent from heaven. That's not to say I had any sort of love for the Germans. I'd been fighting Nazis for months now, seen them kill my buddies, seen what they did to Jews and Gypsies and other undesirables. I was under no illusions as to what they were capable of. Armed Forces radio was always blaring, constantly reminding us that every friendly German civilian is a disguised soldier of hate, armed with the inner conviction that the Germans are superior. They believe that one day it will be their destiny to destroy you. Their hatred and their anger are deeply buried in their blood. A smile is their weapon by which to disarm you. In heart, body and spirit, every German is Hitler. I was keenly aware of the fact that I was a foreign invader in the enemy homeland. On top of all that, rumors were flying amongst the ranks about Operation Werewolf. This was supposedly an elite troop of SS and Hitler Youth operatives who had been trained as commandos to stay behind amongst the population and engage in secret operations, sabotage, assassinations, guerrilla warfare, behind enemy lines. Though we later found out that this was mostly propaganda designed to slow the Allied advance. At the time, we thought it a real threat and acted accordingly, constantly on high alert, constantly on edge, looking out for these werewolves and suspicious of every German we came across. So you can imagine how frayed my nerves were when I got the call to saddle up for a nighttime patrol of an abandoned manor on the edge of town. Reports from villagers had been trickling in all day about the sound of screams and gunfire coming from the estate the previous night, but when a passing infantry unit confirmed those reports later in the evening, my squad was tasked with investigating the source and reporting our findings. It was 2300 by the time we got together and organized, and we set off under cloudy skies with a full moon occasionally peeking through to provide us with light. The village slept around us as we made our way through her cobblestone streets and out towards the manor. It was a cold March night, the snow having just melted away a few days ago, and the wind whipped and moaned through the branches of the dark evergreen trees that circled the town. The estate sat in a clearing in the trees out on the far western edge of town, and it was unlike anything I had ever seen. We didn't see it at first and almost walked right past it. But then a hole in the clouds passed overhead and the light of the full moon lit the manor house up like a spotlight. It was a majestic structure in the Gothic style. The first 2 floors built of large slabs of stone, and third and fourth stories of timber-framed construction with an ornate criss-cross style face. On the far western and eastern corners of the building, large rounded turrets stood out. looming above the structure. The villagers may have called it a manor house, but to me it looked exactly like a castle from a storybook. My unit entered and cleared the structure, but found no one home. The really strange part was, it looked like no one had been in this house for a long time, and nothing had been looted or vandalized. Expensive silver candlesticks still stood on the tables. Gold and jewelry were found in some of the bureaus upstairs, and pricey-looking rugs lined the floor, but nothing was taken. Nazi propaganda photos of smiling Aryan families were everywhere, and a solemn portrait of Adolf Hitler sat on the wall above the fireplace in the gloomy great room. Dominating the space, the place gave me the willies. No one had dared to enter this place, and I remember thinking that maybe I shouldn't be there either. Mercifully, a call for backup rang out from the yard, and I was more than happy to volunteer to go and check it out. Once outside, I found the rest of my unit gathered around an ancient-looking stone barn, 2 stories high and covered in thick moss. Sergeant Bard informed me that groans had been heard coming from inside and ordered us to search it. When we opened her up, we found something very strange. The barn was almost completely full of hay. In every other barn we had found, the hay had either been carried away by retreating German troops, or burnt up to prevent us from using it. This stockpile smelled sweet, looked fresh, and was completely untouched. Sergeant Bard called out a warning and then ordered us to fix bayonets and search the hay piles for hidden enemies. I remember methodically plodding along, stopping every few steps to poke my bayonet down through the hay and into the hard dirt floor below, each thrust making a low thumping sound. After a few minutes, my bayonet hit something different. It made a sharp, hollow sound like a dart hitting a dartboard, and my bayonet remained stuck in the floor. I called the rest of my unit over, and we set about clearing the hay, revealing a wooden trap door in the floor of the barn. My unit silently surrounded the door, training their M1 Garand rifles on it, and Sergeant Bard signaled for me to open the hatch. It was the last thing I wanted to do, but as happens so often in the army, I had no choice. I took a deep breath, bent down, then flung the door open and jumped back in one fluid motion to avoid any gunfire. Nothing but silence came up from the hole in the floor. I crept forward and peered down over the edge, but could see nothing except an old wooden ladder leading down into the darkness. Someone produced a flashlight, and now we could see a stone floor at the bottom of the shaft. About 20 feet below, we began to argue amongst ourselves over who would be first down the hole. But Sergeant Bard cut us off with a hand signal, ordering us to shut up and listen. From somewhere in the darkness below came a weak, ghostly groan. I stepped back in fear and met the gaze of the soldier across from me. His eyes were wide and the color had drained from his face. We turned to the sergeant, and I tried not to meet his eyes, terrified he might select me to go down first. Sergeant Bard gave a grim smile and said that since he was the only one with a Thompson submachine gun, and on account of all the rest of us being worthless chicken shits, he'd go first. I could have kissed him for that. We all waited, tightly gripping our rifles and holding our breaths, while he clambered down the ladder and disappeared out of sight into the darkness beyond. 30 terrifying seconds went by, then a minute, and still we heard nothing from him. We stood looking at each other, no one wanting to be the first to break the silence and admit that something had gone wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard his voice echoing back up from the end of a long hallway. He yelled for us to get our asses down there, and to send a runner for the medic. We climbed down the ladder one by one and found ourselves in a long stone hallway which seemed to head in the direction of the house. At the end of that cold, damp passageway I could see the light from Sergeant Bard's flashlight, and we made our way towards it. We arrived to find the source of the groans we had heard. A dying German lay supine on the ground, bathed in the light from Sergeant Bard's flashlight. 8 rifles were immediately leveled at the wounded man, but he seemed not to notice. His eyes were wide and white, and he seemed to look right through us as he muttered something quietly to himself over and over. A wave of pity for the man washed over me, and I lowered my rifle, kneeled down next to him, and brought my canteen to his lips. He stopped his mumbling for a moment to take a sip, and I finally got a good look at him. He wore the gray-green service uniform of an NCO in the Waffen-SS, an elite force of fanatical soldiers that made up the armed wing of the Nazi Party, and had pledged their loyalty to Hitler alone, though the cuff bands and shoulder boards displayed strange symbols and insignia I had not seen before. And in place of the Totenkopf death head was the profile of a snarling wolf with crossed lightning bolts behind it and Germanic runes around it. His hands had been reduced to bloody tatters and bright white bony nubs, and his torso was torn open, exposing his entrails, which had spilled out onto the ground. It was a miracle he was still alive, though my combat experience told me that he would not be for much longer. Even with medical aid, behind him stood a large steel double door, well out of place in this dank, ancient-looking stone passageway. The wounded man's service rifle was wedged across both doors and held in place by 2 bars handles, preventing the door from opening from the inside. Sergeant Bard reminded me that this man was an enemy and still potentially a threat. He ordered me back to my feet and said that by breaking protocol, I had just volunteered to open the door. I stood up, swallowed hard, and approached the door, but as I did, the bloody remnants of the wounded German's hand shot out and wrapped around my ankle. His eyes had cleared, and now he was looking at me instead through me. He was absolutely terrifying. His voice rose to a yell, and words tumbled from his mouth at a breakneck speed, though I understood none of it as we had neglected to bring a translator. Someone poked him in the ribs with a toe and told him to shut up. His hand dropped away, but it only seemed to encourage his yelling. He grew louder and louder, and as I turned back towards the door, I could now understand what he was saying. It was one word over and over, one of the few German words I did know. Nein, 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 no, no, no. I did my best to ignore him and press on. I reached out for the rifle that was wedged in the door handles, and just as my hand touched it, the world suddenly exploded around me into bright flashes and the roar of gunfire. I turned around to find Sergeant Bard standing there looking grim, smoke slowly rising from the barrel of his Thompson. At my feet I saw that the Kraut had pulled a Luger from his belt and spent his last breath trying to stop me. Lucky for me, Bard had my back. He gave me a nod and a half smile and signaled for me to continue. The rest of the squad took defensive positions and prepared to breach the door. Having seen the German so willing to die, and in such an obviously futile attempt at stopping me from getting to whatever was behind that door, I'd decided I'd better proceed more cautiously. I crouched down and prepared to pull the rifle and immediately jump out of the way of the doors. I had it all played out in my head, but when the time actually came, everything went wrong. The instant the butt of the rifle cleared the handle of the first door, both immediately flew open, the left door slamming into my side. The pain stunned me for a moment, and before I realized what was happening, I was falling to the ground under a tide of gray-green uniforms, cold, heavy flesh, and the stench of death. I hit the stone floor hard. The lights went out and I couldn't move. Something thick, salty and lukewarm dripped steadily from above me onto my mouth and face, and I tasted copper. When I tried to lift my hand to wipe my face, I found they were both stuck under the weight. I looked up to see the ashen corpse face of a dead German soldier. A dark gray helmet was still strapped to his head, but his eyes had been torn out of his face, and the bones between his eye sockets had been ripped out, making his upper face look like one giant eye socket. I remember thinking it looked like the skull of a cyclops from one of them Greek myths. In moments like these, I've found that time sometimes slows down and you find yourself pondering the strangest things, completely unrelated to horrors going on around you. Maybe that's a good thing. After a few moments of knowing what it's like to lay alive and alone, buried in a mass grave, I heard someone yell out, "All clear," and my squad finally pulled the corpses off me. There had been 4 of them piled on. All of them must have been pushed up against the door right on top of each other when they died. Trying to get out, they were torn to shreds and full of holes, their internal organs gutted from behind like hollowed-out pumpkins made into jack-o'-lanterns. Whoever killed these men had done it up close and personal and hadn't been worried about leaving mess. I'd seen a lot of people turned into corpses since landing in France, but these ones had been done with the most brutality, the most hatred. The bodies left in absolute ruin that was barely recognizable as human. It was the most horrible thing I had seen in the war. Up until that point, I'd be seeing a lot worse before the night was through. I took a moment to wipe my face, have a sip of water, and regain my composure. Then I followed my squad into the room beyond. It was icy cold and pitch black except for the few spots of light provided by our flashlights. I'd lost mine somewhere in France a few weeks early, so I had to stay close to the guy in front of me and try to get by using his light. Almost immediately I hear guys around me start stumbling and tripping over things in the darkness. Someone in front of me tumbled over, landing with a wet squishing noise followed by a spat of loud cursing. Bard ordered us to halt and sweep the area with our lights to get an idea of our surroundings. It was a single large room, about the size of the perimeter of the foundation of the house we now stood beneath. It was cold and clammy, and everything, the walls, floor, and ceiling, was built of stone. To my young American eyes, it looked just as I imagined the dungeon of a medieval castle would look. I actually don't think I was far from the truth on that one. Corpses littered the floor, spread out everywhere, some alone off by themselves, others piled atop one another or gathered in small groups. There must have been 30 dead men down there at least, some in the same gray-green uniforms the SS soldier in the hall had worn, others in white lab's coat, now stained red. That's what the men had been tripping over. Some of the corpses were little more than assorted limbs, bones, and piles of offal barely recognizable as human. Others looked like they had been butchered and partially consumed. They must not have been dead for too long, because the stench wasn't completely overwhelming just yet, though I still had to work hard not to gag from the sight alone. In a small clearing in the corpses, I spotted a group of candles standing on the floor. I pulled out my Zippo and started to light them to give us a little extra illumination. I had almost finished lighting them by the time I realized they formed some kind of geometric pattern. In the glow of the candles, I could now see the floor of the clearing. Written there on the stones, in what I knew must be blood, was some kind of large circular sigil that looked straight out of hell itself. Lines criss-crossed one another throughout the circle, queer and unnatural but also somehow familiar. Words of dead languages, esoteric runes, and other stranger alien symbols were laced in between the lines, all in dark red blood. I stepped back in surprise, and out of fear, but also out of respect. I swear I could feel some kind of power coming from it, like a strange and awesome cloud of dark electricity hovering over the sigil. Behind it I found a lectern with what I at first thought was an animal on top, but when I got closer realized was an ancient-looking book, laid open and bound with the thick fur of some kind of animal. On one of the open pages was a drawing of the sigil I had just seen on the floor. On the other page was what appeared to be a list or instructions, handwritten in what I was pretty sure wasn't German, and definitely wasn't English. I called over a few of the guys to check it out. One of them was Catholic and said he thought the writing was in Latin, though maybe an older version of it because he didn't hardly recognize any of the words, except for part of the title at the top which read, Mutatio Vitae. He wasn't quite sure what that meant either. Someone in the far back of the room let out a cry and we cut away from the book and ran back there to see what was going on, hopping over corpses along the way. The back of the room was shaped like a T, and to the left, we found a large iron cage against the back wall. Inside were 3 men, starved and emaciated, their arms pulled up over their heads and chained to rings at the top of the cage. Each had long, unkempt hair and beards. They wore nothing but filthy rags around their waists. The one on the left had a large frizzy tangle of hair on his head and a 6-digit number tattooed on his arm. The one in the middle had the dark skin and features of the gypsies and a large scar down his left cheek. The third man was tall with pale skin, dark blonde hair, and a straight nose. He had brown eyes, which I knew because he was the only one of the prisoners that was conscious. He began to speak in a foreign language, which I think must have been Russian, his cracking voice so hoarse and low we could barely hear it. Someone tried to hold a canteen to his lips through the bars, but he was just out of reach. Sergeant Bard yelled for everyone to start looking around for keys so we could get him out of that cage. But the man began to laugh, a sick wheezing sound. He looked up at us and began to say over and over again, Amerikansky, Amerikansky, Amerikansky. At first we thought he was referring to us, and we reassured him that, yes, we were Americans and were here to help him. He just laughed his mad laughter, shook his head, repeated, Amerikansky, and began to lift his leg and point across the room with his foot. We followed his gaze to where he was directing us and found, in the midst of several Germans whose faces had been torn or chewed off, was a skinny black man, completely naked and lying on his stomach. Blood trickled from at least 25 bullet holes in his back. I knelt down and carefully rolled him over, revealing many more bullet holes as well as a U.S. Army Air Force tattoo of a warplane with its tail painted red and the words, 99th Pursuit Squadron, etched above his heart. I thought for sure he was dead, but when I put my hand in front of his face I felt a weak breath of air. The shiny metal hilt of a knife protruded from the place where his shoulder blade met his neck. It looked to be made of pure silver and was engraved with swastikas and other Nazi symbols. The pommel featured a large symbol resembling a long bar with hooks on either end and a shorter horizontal bar in the middle. I recognized it as an old Germanic heraldic charge known as a Wolfsangel, which had been co-opted by the Nazis. I put my hand around it for a moment, then thought better of it and called for the medic who'd just recently arrived down the ladder. He took one look at the man and said that it was an absolute miracle he was even still alive, but pilot POW or not, there was nothing that could be done for him. At that the pilot began to stir and try to talk. I leaned in close and he whispered in my ear, "Outside. Take me outside." I told the rest of the squad what he had said. Sergeant Bard nodded his head and told me to grant his request, while the rest searched for the keys to the cage and any other clues about what this place was. I hoisted the man's thin frame up onto my shoulders and began the long trudge back down the hallway, up the stairs, and out of the barn. It was a struggle, to be sure, but I eventually made it, and I laid him down on a patch of soft grass, his face bathed in the pale moonlight. The least I could do was help him die out in the open in the fresh air. Instead of down in that crypt, I looked down for a moment at the bullet-riddled young man, and I could feel my heart aching in my chest as I watched the life draining from his eyes. His mouth was moving as if he was trying to say something, though no words came out. I tousled his hair like an older brother, then lied and told him everything was going to be okay, silently cursing the Nazis for the millionth time. Then I stood up and shouldered my rifle to head back down into that dungeon. For the second time that night, a hand shot out and grabbed me around the ankle. I looked down to find a look of desperation and intense strain on the man's face. He motioned with 2 fingers for me to come back, and I bent back down over him like before. He leaned his head up towards mine and, taking the sides of my face in his hands, he whispered, "Please, don't leave, please. Get it out of me. You have get it out of me." I pointed to the hilt sticking out his shoulder, and he nodded weakly and looked relieved. I told him that it might kill him. He said nothing, but his eyes were smiling. I gripped the silver hilt, counted to 3, and tugged on the blade, which pulled free from his flesh with a sick sucking sound. Blood began to shoot out in spurts, though it quickly died down into a trickle. I looked him in the eyes then, knowing I was the last thing he would ever see, and waited for the light of his life to flicker out. He was still grinning. It made me glad to see that he would die smiling. I'd seen far too many go out screaming in agony in this God-forsaken war. I laid his head back gently in the grass and stood back up, looming over his body for a moment in silent prayer. I was about to turn and head back, when a flash of movement on his body caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. I examined him closer to find that it had been one of the bullets lodged in his chest, somehow extricating itself. As I watched, the bullet pushed further and further out of the wound, until it popped out completely and rolled down his chest onto the grass below. Before my eyes, the bullet hole seemed to sew itself back up, the flesh once again becoming whole, the wound disappearing completely. Then it happened to another of the bullets lodged in his body. Then another, and another. Over and over the slugs fell from his body and the wounds healed themselves. His ebony skin seemed to almost glow as it drank in the cold moonlight. I looked down in shock at the knife still in my hand, which was actually more of dagger. It was formed from a single piece of silver, blade hilt and all. Tiny scripts in dozens of languages were inscribed along the length of the blade. I tucked it into my belt and made a dash for the trapdoor in the barn. By the time I got there, I was on the verge of panic, and I screamed down the hole for everyone to get up here and see this. A few exasperated groans echoed down the hallway below, but I could hear them coming. Sergeant Bard and a few others came up and I rushed them over to where the Tuskegee Airman lay. But when we got there, he was gone, his body replaced by a bloody patch staining the bright dewy grass red. The sergeant asked me what was going on. Where had the freed prisoner gone? I began to explain what I had just seen, the bullet wounds healing themselves, but was interrupted by a loud rustling in the bushes in front of us. We raised our rifles up, trained them on the bush, and stood silently listening. None of us were prepared for what we were about to see. Out from the bush stepped the largest, blackest, meanest-looking wolf I have ever seen. It was broad-shouldered, squat, and muscular, especially on its back legs. It was at least twice the size of a regular wolf, almost like a small horse, and our shoulders stood about at an equal level. Thick fur, black as midnight, surrounded its muscular frame. It snarled, foam dripping from its maw, and stared at me. Its eyes glowed bright red in the darkness. No one fired. No one even breathed. We all stood paralyzed, as if collectively hypnotized by this unnatural beast before us. A growl rose in its throat and it took a step forward. I don't know how or why, but my thoughts turned to the knife in my belt. I drew it out and held it up in the air. It looked cold and deadly there, shining harshly in the moonlight. The wolf's eyes snapped to blade for a moment. Then it sat back on its haunch, stared up into the sky and let out a blood-curdling howl, so loud and so terrible that myself and the men around me covered our ears with our hands. I closed my eyes and prayed I'd get out of this somehow. I don't know if the wolf creature was afraid of that silver knife, or if it seeing it there in my hands only reminded it of who I was and what I had done for it. But whatever the reason, when it finished howling, the wolf turned and trotted off towards the forest at the edge of the manor property line. It glanced back at us once over its shoulder, and then disappeared into the evergreen trees. It slipped off into the countryside, into a war-torn land of chaos and confusion, the perfect environment for a wolf to hunt and kill and thrive. We sat in stunned silence for a few moments, no one daring to speak or move, no one wanting to accidentally lure that terrible beast back here. Finally, someone asked if that had really just happened. That seemed to break the spell, and we all stood there shaking our heads. Sergeant Bard came up to me, grabbing me by the collar, and demanded to know every single thing that had happened to the black pilot leading up to this point. I recounted my tale of insta-regeneration and wolf transformation to him. He just nodded his head. It didn't seem like he believed me. And yet, he didn't have a choice, he had seen it too. He ordered us to form a defensive perimeter and calmly asked the radio man to put in a call to base. We waited there for several hours as the call went up the chain of command. Finally, a black unmarked truck showed up and a group of men in gas masks and body armor hopped out. Followed by a full-bird colonel I had never heard of before by the name of Arkwright. He congratulated us on a job well done, said that his unit had been assigned to clean up duty and would take it from here, and told us to head back to camp for chow and hot showers. We stood there shell-shocked as the troops headed into the barn and down into the tunnel. After a few minutes, Sergeant Bard turned and started to walk silently back to town and the rest of us followed. Glancing over my shoulder, the last things I saw were a soldier delicately carrying the fur-covered book I had seen on the lectern, and another two carrying the Russian prisoner out on a stretcher and loading him into the truck. Then a cloud passed over the moon, obscuring the scene from view, and we walked back onto the cobbled streets towards the semblance of civilization. Though they had been extirpated from Germany for almost 50 years. Somewhere out in the night a lone wolf howled mournfully at the moon. The next morning we received orders to head east over the Rhine and back into the fight. And by the day's end we were getting shot at once again. We had no choice but to move on and try to forget about what we had seen. And for a while, we did. It was necessary in order to survive in battle. But once the war ended, and I had plenty of time to think, I've replayed that night over and over in my head 1,000 times. There's so much I can't explain. So much I can't understand. Something horrible happened down in that dungeon. Some wicked satanic ritual or occult experiment. The Nazis created an abomination that wasn't meant to be. And now I can't unsee it. For the next few months we heard whispered rumors from the refugees we passed of serial killers that could turn into wolves by dressing in their fur that were rampaging through the countryside, taking advantage of the chaos of war, terrorizing and feeding upon their victims. Most soldiers laughed these off as the superstitions of terrified peasants, but for my squad, things were different. I have no idea what that thing was, but if I had to guess I'd say it's damn near immortal. And there's a good chance it still stalks the woods of Germany today, looking for victims, hunting for revenge, hoping to wash away the wrongs of the past with torrents of blood. To this day, I say a prayer every evening for anyone unlucky enough to cross its path on a dark night when the moon is full in the sky. Gramps finished his story and leaned back in his rocking chair, eyes clenched tightly. Finally he let out a sigh, opened his eyes, and turned to me. You see, grandson, I believe the actual Operation Werewolf was something very different from what the history books say. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. I'm one of the few who knows. Sworn to secrecy after the war. Once I'd given them everything I knew about the encounter. That's all they wanted. Information. Now then, is there anything you want to ask me? I didn't want to ask. Didn't want to insult him. But I had to know. My lips were already forming the question before I could even think to stop them. Did it really happen? Gramps smiled back at me. He reached down, unsnapped something from his belt, and tossed it to me. It was a scabbard. I drew the knife out, turned it over in my hands. looking at it long and hard. It was one solid piece of silver, blade, hilt, and all. The blade was inscribed with strange symbols and the runic scripts of arcane languages. Swastikas and other Nazi symbols were carved into the hilt, and on the pommel was an ornately decorated symbol of an old Germanic heraldic charge. A wolf's angel. Story. People go missing on my grandparents' property, but the view is just fantastic. My grandparents bought their cabin in the spring of 1965. For the sake of privacy, I am going to be extremely vague while describing the property, but it is somewhere in the Rockies on a small and relatively undeveloped lake. There's a smattering of cottages and cabins around the water, but it is mostly pristine and absolutely gorgeous. They were completely smitten and bought it after visiting once. The cabin itself was relatively small and quaint but incredibly cozy with a stunning view of the lake. A single grand room with the kitchen in the left corner. On the right side were 2 bedrooms with a small bathroom in between. A ladder in the corner led up to the tiny loft area where the kids always slept. That first summer there was absolutely phenomenal. According to my grandmother, she was in love with the view of the lake and the handsome mountains in the distance. They were up almost every weekend, hosting parties and barbecues, indulging in a summer of swimming and bonfires and running the woods. She did admit there was one spot in the corner of their 10 acres that she never did like. She stumbled upon it in the first 2 weeks while out exploring the property. It was in a small clearing in a sort of gully between 2 large hills at the back corner of the property, where their acreage butted against a state park. A feeling of dread washed over her as she crested the hill and looked down and saw a smear of gray in the clearing below. She felt her hackles rise and became acutely aware of a feeling like she was being watched. Carefully making her way down the hill, the feeling only intensified. It felt dead. Everything was a little dimmer there. The forest sounds were hushed and the air felt heavy. The smear turned out to be an area, roughly a circle, about 15 feet across. Any seeds which found it their fate to grow there grew small and twisted, failing to thrive. Even the squirrels and birds seemed to avoid it. Feeling something was very off, she hurried back up the hill, worried it was a bear or mountain lion that made her feel so ill at ease there. She encouraged the children to avoid that area and always avoided it herself when she could. She reassured herself by reasoning it was a geothermal phenomenon and put it firmly out of her mind. Eventually summer gave way to autumn and my grandparents began preparing for a long winter of skiing and ice fishing. They chopped and prepared firewood for the wood-burning stove in the main room, carefully stacking it in a small lean-to on the side of the cabin. It was early November and there was finally enough snow for them to embark on the first ski weekend of the season, and they were thrilled to be so close to several different ski resorts. My grandparents left the kids at home and went with their longtime friends, Bea and Al. The couples arrived shortly before dark on Friday evening and settled in for a weekend of fun. They had dinner and drinks and sat around the table chain smoking cigarettes while playing cards. As my grandmother tells it, they went to sleep sometime around 10:30 as they wanted to be up with the sun and be ready to hit the slopes by the time the runs opened. They bid their good nights and tucked into their beds. It was at about midnight that everyone was awakened by a ruckus being made at the front door. Fierce pounding rattled the door on its hinges. Everybody convened in the living room to see what was going on. groggy and confused. They were in a very rural area. The driveway was over a half-mile long and ran off of a rarely traveled dirt road. It was well below freezing outside and snowing, so a visitor of any sort seemed unlikely. My grandmother voiced what her mind went to thinking: it was a bear. They stood in a sort of shocked silence as they watched the door jiggle from the force of whatever was on the other side. Suddenly, the banging stopped and a woman's voice called out to them, "Please, let me inside, please. It's so cold out and I have my baby with me." Al stepped forward towards the door, reaching for the latch, but something about the tone, something about the entire situation had my grandma feeling suspicious. Something wasn't right and she couldn't put her finger on it. "Don't," my grandma whispered fiercely to Al before he unlocked the door. He paused with his hand in midair. "Something about this isn't right. I don't know what, but I really don't think we should open the door." The room broke into whispered arguments. Al thought it was ridiculous to ignore a woman and child in need. B was backing him up. Even Grandpa felt unsure about it. But he trusted his wife. She had been right about a lot of little things before. Like the time she insisted on turning around and going home when they had not left 15 minutes before because she had a feeling. They came home to a smoldering fire behind the refrigerator that surely would have burnt their house down if they hadn't caught it when they had. His guts twisted at the thought of whoever was on the other side of that door being as devastating as a house fire to trigger this reaction in his wife, who normally wouldn't hesitate to give a stranger the shirt off her back. Their bickering was interrupted by the door banging. And again, a woman's voice pleading at them through the thick wood planks. "Please, let me inside, please. It's so cold out and I have my baby with me." They all listened to this mystery woman as she repeated verbatim what she had said a minute ago. But now they were more aware of a flatness to her voice. An almost mechanical sort of rote quality to it. Everyone stood very still and quiet, making eye contact that showed they understood now what had triggered my grandma's suspicion. "Please, let me inside, please. It's so cold out and I have my baby with me," the woman said in the same off tone. "Wah, wah, wah." She began imitating a baby cry, pitching her voice up, but still the same bizarre monotony to it. My grandma said she got an icy feeling in her gut and her face got hot as her heart began pumping adrenaline. Something was seriously wrong with whoever was outside. Everyone was frozen in place, eyes locked on the door. 4 Grecian statues in flannel pajamas and slippers. Whoever it was began scratching on the door like an animal. "Please let me in. I know you're in there. I can hear you all." Her voice sounded like it was getting frantic. The banging began again and she began screaming, "Let me in, let me in, let me in," over and over again. It took several minutes, but eventually the banging stopped and she quieted down. Grandpa George suggested they all head back to bed and look around outside when it was light. They hesitantly shuffled back to beds, feeling a lot less cozy and comfortable than they had in the same position just 15 minutes ago. They prepared for a night of restless sleep and tried to drift off. The banging continued intermittently for the next few hours, but seemed to finally come to a stop. My grandparents fell asleep and woke around 7:30 when the sun was beginning to rise. They opened their bedroom door and walked into the main room, and my grandma felt her stomach drop when she saw the door wasn't locked anymore. She felt furious with B and Al because one of them had obviously unlocked the door. She couldn't believe the foolhardiness. She rapped on their bedroom door and swung it open before they even could respond. But only B was in the bed. She woke up shocked and obviously groggy. B had no idea what was going on. Putting on her robe, B came out into the main room with them. "What's going on?" she asked. "Did you or Al unlock the door last night?" my grandma asked. B looked uncomfortable and stared down at her feet. She explained that Al hadn't been able to handle the banging. Even if something was off with the woman, she still deserved their help. He had thought my grandmother was being unnecessarily cruel to deny someone shelter in the cold and snow. B had begged him not to, but he got dressed and snuck out into the main room and had gone outside to help. B had tried to stay up and wait for him, but she eventually fell asleep until just now. They checked the bathroom and the loft space, but Al was definitely not in the cabin. Maybe he had gone to the main road to help her with a car repair? Or helped lead her along the lake trail to another cabin with more accommodating occupants. They quickly dressed and opened the door, and they all stood in a distinctly distressed silence as they only saw a single set of footprints heading away from the cabin into the woods. There was no sign of a woman's footprints whatsoever, just Al's large boot prints disappearing into the tree line. My grandpa grabbed his shotgun and he and my grandma headed out to follow the tracks to try and find Al, leaving B behind in case Al came back of his own accord. It was difficult terrain to navigate in the snow. Some areas they had to wade through waist-high drifts and struggled up snowy hills and down icy rocks. They had no idea how or why Al had done this on his own in the pitch dark and were honestly expecting to find him with his neck broken at the bottom of every hill they summited, unfamiliar with the stark winter appearance of her happy woods. It took my grandma a moment to realize they were heading closer and closer to the dead zone. Sure enough, they followed his footsteps to the top of a hill and they could see down into the gully, the clearing where nothing grew. Even in winter, it was still drab and gray. The snow seemed to melt from that area and gently steamed, reassuring my grandmother of its geothermal properties. Far less reassuring was that they could see Al's footsteps leading up to the dead spot. But no Al and no more footsteps anywhere else in the gully. It was like he vanished. They made their way down the hill and canvassed the area. They saw no sign of him. They looked all over, calling for him for over half an hour before they decided they needed to head to town and get the police involved. It took almost an hour for them to make it back, and B was frantic with worry when she saw them come back without him. A day that was supposed to be filled with skiing and hot toddies by the lodge fireplace had turned into a nightmarish blur of police interviews, organizing search parties, and canvassing every square inch of the property and surrounding park, trying to find any sign of Al or the supposed woman who had been banging on the door. By the time it got dark, my grandparents were exhausted. B got taken into town by the police because she didn't want to stay at the cabin. Honestly, neither did they. But they were too exhausted to make the drive to a hotel, and they wanted someone to be there in case Al miraculously reappeared. They slept with the shotgun by the bed. Banging on the door woke them up at about midnight. Their hearts felt a few moments of elation, believing it might be Al, when instead they heard, "Please, let me inside, please. It's so cold out and I have my baby with me." Spirits brought back down to earth. They held each other and listened. as sporadically through the night, whatever it was, tried to plead its way through the door before it apparently gave up and they were finally able to sleep. The next day went very much the same, scrambling over snowy acres with a search party looking for any trace of their friend and finding nothing. My grandparents had to go back home and they left begrudgingly, feeling like they'd failed their friend by not being able to find him. For taking him up there, for not hearing him leave and stopping him. Layers of guilt anyone involved with a beloved friend's disappearance would naturally feel. After a few days, the search party was called off as it was presumed Al was dead by this point and the terrain was rugged and dangerous for the crew. My grandparents went sporadically through the winter to continue searching their property in the state park. They never heard from him again, but they did hear from the woman at the door. It only took a few trips that winter for them to give up on finding Al and to be too scared of that flat, demanding voice coming from the outside. They seriously discussed selling the place, seeing as it would be permanently blighted by Al's disappearance and the crippling fear they felt whenever they heard that imitated baby cry through the door. My grandma was hesitant, though. She really had fallen in love with this land and the cabin. Looking at the mountains over the lake made her feel like her heart was soaring through the clouds. It was such an intense and pure beauty that it made her heart ache in a deliciously wistful way. She felt like she would regret passing this place on to other people, both for what she would lose, but also what she would be exposing an innocent new buyer to. They didn't return until spring when all the snow had melted. The first night back up there, my grandma lay awake anxiously awaiting the banging to start around midnight. But it never came, nor did it come the next night. They came back up for a few more weekends, but they didn't hear from the lady at the door. After that, the anxiety faded away and a sense of security was restored. They all slept peacefully in their beds after days gallivanting about the lake and through the woods. Eventually the snow fell and they went up for another attempt at a ski trip. But the first night there with snow on the ground, the thing came back and began going through the exact same motions. They winterized the cabin the next day and didn't come back until spring. So, that became the tradition. The family was never made privy to the tragic disappearance of Al. He became a hidden chapter of my grandparents' lives. They didn't tell their kids for fear of scaring them. Us grandkids didn't really question growing up why we never went in the winter. My grandma just told me it was too cold and drafty up there and that it was far more pleasant and cozy at the ski lodge when we wanted to indulge in winter sports. That worked until I got into college in the early 2000s and word got out in my friend group about my family cabin on the lake. I was able to avoid anyone asking to use it until my friend Cody got it into his head to convince me to sneak up one December to use it as a base camp for a weekend of skiing. "No one will know," he said. "We can invite girls," he implored. "It's sitting empty," he whined. I was 19 at the time and knew nothing about Al's tragic disappearance or any spooky door banging at the cabin during winter. So regrettably, I caved. The plan was for Cody and I to go up Thursday night and get things set up at the cabin and shoveled. We were going to skip classes Friday and snowboard until it was time for the girls to get up in the evening, where we would greet them and officially start the weekend. We got there and I was awed by the stark beauty of the terrain in winter. I'd never seen the lake frozen. How serene it was in the cold sunlight. The cabin looked quaint and cozy with the snow piled around it. We both pointed and laughed in delight at a woodpecker fluttering from tree to tree around the cabin, banging away at the dead trees in the afternoon sunlight. We set to work and started shoveling off pathways and started a fire inside to warm it up. Something I hadn't considered was the pump to the well being shut off for the winter, so we would have to use the old outhouse. I hoped the girls wouldn't mind, but using a cold outhouse would quickly fall to the bottom of my concerns after night fell and I found out why we don't use the cabin in the winter. Cody and I were still up at midnight, drinking beers and playing cards, when we both flew out of our seats as the door started banging so hard I could hear the jam creak against the pressure. Chests heaving, we both stared at the door in shock. Neither of us had heard a car or any footsteps outside. It was so quiet out. You could easily hear a car driving on the main road a half-mile away, let alone someone's footsteps crunching in the snow outside. We heard a woman on the other side of the door, crying and yelling, "Please, let me inside, please. It's so cold out and I have my baby with me." Something about the way she said it sounded too weird to me. I felt goosebumps shoot down my arms. Cody made like he was heading towards the door to open it, and before I could even think about it, I made a quick tisk noise to make him look at me and vigorously shook my head for him to not move towards the door. He vigorously nodded his head back at me and jerked his shoulders up and motioned to the door with both arms and an exasperated face. Like, "Come on, man. It's some chick with a baby." I couldn't shake it though. I couldn't believe neither of us hadn't heard a thing as she came up to the door. No cars, no snow, no boots on the porch. We were interrupted by more banging on the door as whoever was on the other side proceeded to plead their case. "Please, let me inside, please. It's so cold out and I have my baby with me. We cannot open the door. I have a really bad feeling about this." It would have been obvious to anyone outside there were people in the cabin, but I instinctively wanted to stay quiet and had leaned in to whisper to Cody, "I don't know if this is a trap for a robbery or what, but let's just go to bed, man." The banging continued and I think the bizarre nature of this whole exchange sunk in for Cody a bit and he nodded his head in agreement. We tiptoed to our beds and tried to fall asleep with the weird commotion on the front porch. I had just drifted off when I thought I heard the door latch shut. I wrote it off and thought Cody must have been using the bathroom, but I never heard him go back to his bedroom. Suddenly feeling suspicious and more awake, I got up and checked. The front door was no longer locked and Cody was nowhere in the cabin. I opened the door and with the porch light, I could just see what I thought was a man-sized figure disappear into the tree line across the yard. Wondering what the fuck Cody was thinking, I quickly threw on some jeans and boots, grabbing my coat, hat, and a flashlight as I ran out the door to go after him. It had begun snowing, which obscured what I could see, but I noted there was only one pair of boot prints heading out the door and through the yard that I began following into the woods. It was very rugged terrain and quite difficult to follow his path. I couldn't fathom what he was doing out here by himself. I tried to move along as quickly as possible. He had only a few minutes lead on me, but I couldn't even see him through the falling snow and thick trees. Eventually, I crested a hill and finally saw Cody standing down at the bottom. What I was seeing didn't make sense to me, though. It looked like he was wearing a cloak of some sort. It obscured his head like a hood and draped down his whole body. And he was standing in front of a circle of black in the ground where the snow didn't accumulate. As my brain struggled to figure out what was draped over him, the ground shuddered and a gaping hole in the black earth opened up right in front of Cody. Adrenaline kicked in and I half slid and half ran down the hill, trying to get to him and pull him back. When I got up to him and shined the flashlight on him, I realized the cloak was pink and slimy looking. The inside of the sinkhole that had just opened in front of us looked similarly pink and slimy. A reek of death and rot filled the air in the gully. Confused, I reached for his shoulder with my free hand, touching the cloak, and swung Cody around to face me. The texture of the slime and tissue that surrounded him made me think of saliva and a tongue. A massive tongue to a massive creature. I saw Cody's face and gasped. It looked like he was being digested. The skin on his face was melting off in clumps, revealing the musculature underneath. His left eyebrow dripped off. The tissue surrounding him pulsated. He let out a small whimpery moan, and before I could even process, he fell into the steaming pit with the tongue still wrapped around him. The ground quickly snapped back shut, like it had never happened, except for a gentle steam in the air. I stood in shock for just a moment before I began running. I scrambled back up the hill and ran all the way back to the cabin, my mind racing. It was snowing so hard by this point. Our footprints from the way in were already becoming obscured. I thankfully was able to find my way back in my panicked state before the snow completely covered our tracks. It wasn't until I got back to the yard that I noticed my hand burning and realized the slime from the whatever that was still on my hand. I frantically washed my hand in the snow, horrified at the thought of my skin melting away like Cody's. I lost some skin on my palm, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been. I took a moment to compose myself before I ran inside, grabbed my keys, started up my shitbox Ford and raced down the driveway as fast as the snow would let me. I was grateful the closest town was on a popular trucking route, so there was a 24-hour diner with a payphone I could use. I froze when I got to the payphone. Before I called 911, I decided to call my grandparents and be forthright about this. A kid just got swallowed into the earth on their property and I felt they deserved to know before I called the cops and a shit show started for them. It was probably 4 a.m. at this point. I was exhausted and traumatized, and the second I heard my grandma's sleepy and concerned voice on the other end of the line, I lost it and began crying. I admitted to using the cabin without her knowing and just said my friend disappeared in the night and I had to call the cops. She was very quiet for a moment. She told me to stay put at the diner, to contact the police, get a cup of coffee, and that her and Grandpa would be there in a few hours. I called the cops next and sat at the diner nursing a cup of coffee while images of Cody's face melting off kept replaying in my head. What the fuck was that thing? Did it hunt by luring people out using sympathy? Was it seriously a dismembered 6-foot-long tongue banging on our door last night? I couldn't tell the cops about this. They'd either think I was a loon or that I'd killed Cody myself. The police came and took my statement. I kept it streamlined. I just said I woke up, heard the door close, saw Cody walk into the woods by himself in the middle of the night, and that I tried to follow, but had to turn back because of the weather and terrain. It was decided with the state of the storm that they would wait until daylight and for the snow to let up before taking me back out to the property to show them where he'd walked off to. A while after, my grandparents showed up and I burst into tears again. We sat in the sticky diner booth with cups of coffee in the pale morning light and I was able to explain the whole story. I felt embarrassed for telling them such a wild story, but I almost had to say it all out loud to someone else to make it real for myself. 2. Amazingly, my grandparents looked very grave the whole time I talked and didn't chastise me for telling tales. I thought I saw a knowing glance between them when I mentioned the banging on the front door. My grandmother's face turned white when I described where and how Cody actually died. That is when they finally shared with me their side of this story and when I learned about Al disappearing the same way decades ago. Grandpa George lamented their lack of transparency with the family, but was grateful in a way to finally have closure. Grandma stayed quiet. I was honestly relieved that they believed me and had experienced the same events at the cabin. After a while, the snow let up. We all got into my grandpa's truck and made our way to the cabin to meet with police. When we got there, Grandma wandered away to look at the lake and I followed her. She looked austere, facing the mountains in the distance across the ice. I lied. I've lied for years. I always knew that thing was there. She spoke to me softly. I knew there was that evil here. On this land. The first summer I was up here, I witnessed it eat a full-grown buck. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. After Al was taken, though, I tried to kill it. Tried to blow it up with dynamite. It didn't work. She continued to gaze out over the fresh snow, blinding white in the morning light. I watched her steel herself as she took a deep breath. I knew that evil was here. I didn't want to believe and now we've both lost friends to it. Grandma trailed off for a moment before she continued her thought with conviction. But this view is just fantastic. I reached out and held her hand as we gazed out over the lake and mountains together. A woodpecker flew overhead. Behind us, I could hear the police arriving and talking to Grandpa. My eyes filled up with tears. Yeah, Grandma, the view is awfully fantastic, isn't it? Mysteries are everywhere, and some may be closer than you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mystery. See you in the next story.